There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar for Isaka, South Florida. You are in the right place, and I'm going to allow just a couple of minutes for people to load and join into the session that will be starting in just a few moments now, where we have a discussion that's on the theme of risk-based information security management and communication topics. So there's some great content that we're going to be covering within the next few minutes, and we're excited to have you today on this Wednesday Lunch and Learn with Isaka, South Florida. So it looks like it's 12 right now. So I'll go ahead and start off with the introductions and the brief agenda to get us going right before this presentation. So you are you are being hosted by myself, Rob Valdez. I'm currently serving as the president of Isaka, South Florida. And we also have on the line with us Pete Christians, who is the secretary of Isaka, South Florida, member of our board, and is also serving in programming duties as well. And so we're very grateful to have Pete with us today. You're about to hear in this session a presentation on risk-based information security management. We asked for Reciprocity to take this theme and kind of make their own presentation out of it. So they did exactly that. And we're thrilled to have them do that in just a moment. As a reminder, it is always good if you're able to use the Zoom client to participate with this webinar. The next best way is to load this up in the Chrome browser so that you have access to the full features that are available to you. That would include things like the Q&A module, where you can throw in there questions that David can answer either during the presentation or maybe at the end, and or the chat, where you can reach out to us if there's some kind of question that you have. And of course, the polling, there's going to be polling in this session, and it's an interactive way to participate and have some exchange of information with our presenter. Now, the polling is not what's actually determining your CPE credit. You're logging in, and your participation, just your logging in and the amount of time that you have this loaded, that's what determines your CPE credit. Those certificates get sent out within approximately a week. So we look forward to being able to provide those to you in due time afterwards. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and make a very brief introduction of Dave Schmoeller, the Director of Program Architecture and Product Solutions for Reciprocity Labs. Dave has 30 years of progressive GRC experience across diverse industries and all levels of an organization. Global experience includes leading customers to business value, building teams, product marketing development, and product and program solutions as a Chief Audit Executive, overseeing operational and IT audits, enterprise risk management, and SOX compliance, as well as business process evaluation and fraud investigations. So we're very lucky to have Dave with us today. And please go ahead and take it away, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. It's all the fun stuff that that auditors do, and you know, I've had the pleasure here now to be at Reciprocity for about 6 years. And most of that time I've spent in customer success, so it's been really fun working with customers, particularly and primarily in security departments or risk departments. So it's really been fun to really focus on information security. And you know, kind of my journey, I've been working in the product marketing team the last 9 months with our new product launch, and now I'm on a product strategy team, which is really even more fun because I get to work even more as part of the product team. So thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. We're going to talk about compliance as a catalyst for risk within this theme. And you already know about me. I will just add that I live in Perdido Key, Florida, which is just about as far away from Miami as possible and still being in the state. I'm on the very western edge of the Panhandle. And Miami's a beautiful place, but hey, I'm also a fellow Floridian. So thanks again. So today's session, I'm going to cover really risk-based information security management and informed communications with decision makers. That's, as Rob mentioned, through the regulations and best practices as we all probably have seen, industry's been pushing organizations to take a much more proactive approach to security, which ultimately means making strategic decisions and where to prioritize your investments. Much of what I'm going to cover today is really show how effective compliance is a catalyst for developing a proactive IT security and risk management program. So the topics I'm going to cover within this theme are challenges in the marketplace and really putting risk into business context, simplifying the journey to risk by leveraging your compliance that probably already exists, and then ultimately just a little bit about tools out there in the market, as well as kind of shifting your mind to risk. So really before 2020, organizations had really multi-year strategies to move to digital processes through cloud or hybrid solutions and also service providers. And many were looking at 2025 and beyond to implement gradually those more digital services and infrastructure. But look, the pandemic, of course, forced many organizations into accelerating their digital strategies and their transformation efforts. So while they may have planned to do this over a period of even maybe 1 to 5 years or even beyond, to this now, the businesses had to do this in a matter of weeks or even days. And it's because we all know, employees suddenly unexpectedly couldn't go to the office anymore due to local and state mandates. Thankfully, us here in Florida, we're probably a little bit better with that than many. But then customers were also forced into buying virtually. So all the brick and mortar operations ceased for a bit, and that transformation to the remote work and a remote flexible infrastructure really became the necessity to survive. Now, there's been more exposure than was probably expected for those working from home and all those other rapidly implemented applications and processes. As I mentioned, this happened in a matter of days and weeks and years. We were all there, so we know, but we can all appreciate that a lot of it was just really thrown together just to keep things moving forward versus just coming to a complete halt. The general lack of security and controls, of course, was because it was really rapid and an unplanned digital transformation. And that just simply, in my opinion, exposed some really basic security controls that just weren't ignored. They were put in place not fast enough. And I mean, it makes sense. I mean, risk managers, security managers had to overlook that in order to keep employees working and keep the revenues flowing. Now, security assessments and remedies and all those were implemented later on. But while those have been exposed, and there's still some out there, the threat actors are certainly taking advantage of all the security gaps. And that also resulted in numerous incidents and breaches that we've all seen and has been dominating the media headlines the last couple of years. So what does all this mean? Well, it just adds up to more risk. And understandably, I think now more than ever, there's just greater interest in the formal risk management to drive better decisions on security. So putting all this into perspective, right? Before the pandemic, yes, there was interest. We were going to do some longer term planning and transform the businesses, kind of taking a risk-based approach perhaps. But suddenly now we're thrust into this universe where everything happened quickly. And I think because of all the media headlines and, I think over the last probably 10 years, boards and executives are more and more informed. It's just putting a lot of interest in here. So businesses and organizations, and I'm seeing this from a GRC software vendor perspective, there's more and more interest in leveraging risk management and most importantly to enable better decisions about security and of course security of all their business partners out there as well. Now, some of the challenges, certainly pandemic drives the interest, but it's not the only thing that CIOs are facing out there. CIOs want to prove to the customers that they can trust them with their sensitive data, right, in the company. They also want to eliminate time being wasted on various activities, and they also want to put their sales team in a better position to just close and win deals faster and even more often. So really, CIOs GRC programs is a lot about maintaining security and protecting data privacy. They want to also demonstrate compliance and effectively manage risk, and all of this is in the name of growing and retaining revenue. So the challenges that they have to overcome to build these out, there's many of them. We actually did a survey of primarily mid-market CIOs and across multiple industries nationwide, and just want to understand how can they better achieve their GRC goals, their governance, risk, and compliance goals. And you can see here, more than 40% of those respondents said they struggled with limited resources and budgets. I think that certainly there's more compliance requirements out there, risks have been increasing, and it's often a really resource intensive activity to respond to that. So this doesn't surprise me that this is a big challenge. I also think this is where risk management and that formal risk program really helps, because it really shows you where you should apply your resources to reduce the highest risk. And then you can also ignore the lower risk areas, and it just puts your money where it has the biggest impact. Now, the second thing on the list was about 20% of the respondents cited new and changing regulations. That's very true. I mean, there's been lots of certainly momentum in privacy. And again, I think media headlines tend to influence folks who are making decisions out there on risk and trying to control it. But ultimately, it just means that businesses need to make sure that they're on top of, their security and compliance side, as well as looking at the risk end, so that nothing falls through the cracks. Because none of us want to show up in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or anything else out there. And last but not least, on the pain points is really just tracking and maintaining compliance. And again, that's 15%. I think applying risk management can really reduce that burden, because ultimately risk management will guide you to apply your resources to reduce the risk in the highest areas. And ultimately, I think that drives better security, because then you have the most resources to manage the biggest risk. And it should put you in a better position to be the most secure that you can. And I think all of these, from the survey results, aligns with the pain points that I see when I speak to customers and prospective customers. But there's other topics that I think it's a lot less attention, and that is trust. Now, before I get to the trust topic, because I think it's really interesting, I think let's do a poll. I just spoke to survey results from CIOs on their top challenges, but I would love to hear more about what yours are. So Rob, do you want to spin up a poll? Perfect. Thank you very much for doing that. So what is your biggest GRC challenge? Is it constrained resources or budget, continuously changing risk landscapes, reporting and monitoring on risk and compliance, broadening stakeholder expectations, or perhaps it's something else? So please, feel free to add something in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll give you a moment here to fill that out. All right, Rob, we're ticking up. I think we've got over 50. Maybe just give it a few more seconds. Yeah, I love all the participation here. This is awesome. So everybody, thanks for chiming in. Let's count back here from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's go ahead and end that poll. It looks like, yeah, this is fantastic. So roughly half, so even a little bit more, just with constrained resources and budget. Again, that's pretty true from what I see. Again, talking with customers and at least from our group, certainly. Yeah, lots of changes in the risk landscape, right? We know that not just the pandemic, but I think what I think is even more important, as I mentioned, just the digital transformation of businesses has really created a lot of new risk and a lot of different risks that the companies weren't necessarily prepared for. And yeah, look, fantastic results. I think this is pretty consistent with what I see out in the marketplace too. So thanks for participating. Good stuff. All right, so let's talk a little bit about trust. So now more than ever, like, companies depend on the trust of customers, their partners, and their employees, and it really helps them to be in a competitive position and ultimately achieve sustainable growth of revenues, profitability, and market share. And why is trust so important to the success of your business? We believe at Reciprocity it's really a new human currency for doing business with each other. And I did some research on the topic of trust. Certainly, as a lifetime auditor, I spent about 25 years in audit. The trust was always something really interesting and kind of mindful. I found some good surveys and good information published out there from Deloitte. There's also some things from social media work, and this has been really over the last couple of years. But customer loyalty is one huge topic. 62% of people who reported highly trusting a brand will almost buy exclusively from that brand over competitors in the same category. So if they like your company and your brand, they continue to buy over and over and over, regardless of if your product's the best or if your product's the cheapest. They'll just continue to buy. That's loyalty, and that's the trust. Now, if you lose the trust, it costs, according to surveys and some research, about $2.5 trillion per year when you lose trust again, that's globally to brands, but it really just shows, look, if you lose that trust, you're going to lose the revenue. And brands that broke the trust due to scandals lost approximately 20 to 56% of their market capitalization. So really showing up in the headlines or other things, losing the trust is really pretty damaging, not just to revenues, but also to the value of the company. And again, I think this is what I would expect. It's almost 4 out of 5 customers, or 81% cite that being able to trust the brand to do what is right is a deal breaker, and a very deciding factor on whether or not to buy or do business with a company. And I think it's that's kind of above and beyond all the profitability. What does this cost me, and what am I getting? This is really important, and I don't know if I was a little bit surprised, but because we talk so much about the financial side of deals, but really it shows that trust is super important. Now, I did some other research, and this came from Deloitte and EY collectively, that 69% of companies across all industries and geographies report an increase of threats to their business. But only 9% of boards are confident that they're protecting their organizations from cyber attacks. Now, why that's important is if there's lots of threats out there, certainly we see that. That's the increasing in the risk landscape. But boards don't really trust us to be able to protect it. Well, ultimately, that's really a critical thing for the company, because we know trust is important, but earning and keeping that trust is a struggle, and with the stakeholders, which includes your customers, your partners, your employees, of course, your board. So what information security leaders must do, you really must see, understand, and act on risk. You need to stay compliant as all these regulations change, which we know is a challenge. And then really, most importantly, communicate the business impact. It's really taking your compliance and your risk and communicating it in the context of business priorities. And if you can do that, all of that will build and support a better cyber risk program, of course, a cybersecurity program as well, that ultimately enables the business, which enables trust. Now, one way to do that is certainly building a roadmap, and first defining the risk profile to identify your critical enterprise risk, particularly your IT risk, as they retain or relate to data assets and systems. Then building a cyber risk roadmap to manage the information security, which would include, of course, your compliance. And ultimately, this will all enable better decision-making on security, because it takes a risk-first approach, so you can, again, better communicate risks, what you're doing about the risk, all in the context of business priorities. Of course, being proactive and being strategic is not a novel idea, and I'm sure it's driving your organization out there today. But we've noticed there's more interest in more demand to have proactive information security. And so what I want to speak to here is just applying strategy for the relevance for risk and compliance. So first, defining that and communicating a company-wide strategy, which includes what the markets are that you're in, those that you want to enter. And then if you know that go-to-market strategy, it significantly influences and guides your identification of relevant risk, and as well as compliance requirements in those markets. So as you understand your company strategy and your market strategy, then you better identify those enterprise risk, your IT risk, and all the information security compliance requirements as they relate to your significant data assets and your systems. And ultimately, that all kind of translates loosely to your risk profile. So an example of this would be if you're largely a US-based company today, but you're thinking about moving into Europe, say in the next year to 18 months. Well, naturally, operating internationally is going to expose you to more risk, and probably new risk and even different risk, in addition to all the additional compliance requirements, such as GDPR. Perhaps you now have to follow ISO for information security standards. And again, knowing all of that kind of ahead of time as you're strategically thinking and being proactive, then it helps you think strategically and intentionally about where to invest your assets and your investments. The next thing is investing in your risk management and your infrastructure. Of course, that's finding the right people, the right tools, and then optimizing your profile and your compliance posture. And of course, finally, acting just to install good risk management and compliance processes. Ultimately, it's trying to get robust oversight of risk and compliance, ultimately, better security, so that you can have an updated inventory of your risk, your potential threats, your vulnerabilities, mitigation costs. I'm sure most of you out there are familiar with this, but again, it's really important because this ultimately drives where you make those investments, right? And don't forget about third parties, right? Because you want to have some process and oversight on your third parties, and even your vendors of your third parties. Is I've heard it coined as the fourth party, because they may also process and store your sensitive information data, and we don't want to overlook that as well. So, a lot of companies have traditionally approached compliance as a check the box exercise, but really that doesn't protect you against risk. It helps you meet minimum requirements, and it certainly can get you a certification, but that's where it really stops. It's really, taking that approach of control assessments or a pass fail versus where I think we want to be with proactive security and proactive risk management is just, hey, our control is effective. Do they not just effectively meet requirements, but are they also achieving operational goals like effectiveness or efficiency, or in how effective are they at reducing risk, right? That's really what we want to focus on. Now, if we think about compliance frameworks, they really hold all organizations to a very similar, if not the exact same standard, but it's a bit funny because really no two organizations are the same. And I think it really demonstrates, at least on the surface, that compliance is really just everything is equally important, no matter who you are, what you are. And it doesn't really consider the risk side of it and how to prioritize stuff, right? That's really what risk management leads to better decisions, because you know what your business is trying to achieve, your strategies out there and how you're trying to get there. And that helps you put everything into perspective to know, should this compliance requirement, yes, you may have to check it at a minimum, but should you go above and beyond that to also reduce risk and ultimately support the business success? I think as you understand the starting point of compliance and controls, the next action here is just building inherent risk off of your compliance frameworks and controls. So again, this is kind of taking compliance first and then building out risk. So if you look at controls to determine, are those implemented controls effectively addressing the highest amount of risk? So if you think about inherent risk, kind of what's behind all these compliance requirements, if you don't focus on that, everything kind of falls apart. All you're doing then is checking the box. Companies really need to just think differently about this. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to go about this, but again, having a strategic roadmap for IT security that isn't just on security and compliance, but also what we're going to do about risk. So let's talk a little bit about building that better information security program, which includes compliance and risk. Of course, leverage business activities, your operations and processes, and just think about how they incur risk, right? That includes, again, using that compliance program to kind of look behind the control, look behind the requirements, and what is the inherent risk that thing's trying to protect you against. And if you do that, then you see the controls, that also mitigates the risk. So for them, reviewing control effectiveness to understand, hey, are these actually addressing my highest inherent risk? And of course, enabling continuous monitoring, that's kind of down the road. First things first, let's look and see what we have if you're not already looking at risk. And then make sure that, if you're not doing both compliance and security and risk, just sharing information seamlessly. Just as a side note, we've had a user group, I think late last year, and approximately 80% of our customer base in attendance said they were doing both risk and compliance. And I know a couple, 2 or 3 years ago, that was very, very different. It was more like 10% of folks were doing both. So I think it really, again, shows kind of the shift in the market. So again, thinking about being proactive, right? We want to not just think about security, but thinking about business strategy and thinking about how does that impact what we're doing, right? Think about that proactivity. So I mentioned, as a kind of an example here going into Europe, but if you're working on an ISO certification, just to illustrate what I mean by this, about thinking about strategy versus tactics. Say you identify, hey, I need 23 more controls because ISO requires them. So how are you going to respond and implement those? Well, that's really taking the tactical approach, kind of, well, this is what they require, so I have to put that in place. And look, there's certainly a place for that. But I think what you want to do is really tie your actions more to the strategy, right? In this example, you're trying to enter a European market. You need to now follow ISO, and maybe you need to, and of course, GDPR, and those are all relevant. But really what you need to do is think about what are the new risks that they're exposing to my business? What's my business trying to achieve? And what's all the types of things that could derail us, particularly around, again, information technology? And how am I going to encounter those? What's the probability? What's the impact? And then shifting security activities and investments to make sure that those risks aren't materializing and that we can be more successful in the market. Now, you want to balance that and certainly incorporate what's required for you from ISO and GDPR, but being proactive really means thinking strategically, kind of above and beyond the compliance requirements. Now, I think at the executive and board level, this kind of discussion and this type of proactivity really rings true. I know that from my experience with executives and boards, having that higher level strategic conversation is more important to them and they're going to be more receptive. And so it also makes that budget conversation a little bit easier. I know it's always a little challenging, but if we know that we have a lack of resources and budget, we know that's really a big challenge. I think even in our survey, we're right under 50%. So if anything we could do to make that conversation easier, the better. And ultimately, of course, we have to have the right foundation, which be controls. And I'm, again, assuming we have controls in place. Want to offer you just some other thoughts here, kind of the foundation of probably today, your IT security management program. You're dealing with controls and whether or not you're managing them, right? That's kind of the risk. And controls and risk really deal with the same or similar topics, but it's really from just an opposite perspective and an opposite language. So controls help you make things go right. They help you to be compliant with your compliance requirements. And they also help prevent bad things from occurring, and they detect when things go wrong. So that's a really high level, sort of my definition and take of what controls do. Now, if we look on the other side of this coin, risk speak to what could possibly go wrong, or what are the adverse consequences and all the negative impacts that there could be on an organization, right? So typically you identify risk and then you document controls and how to reduce the likelihood of those risks occurring. So my whole point with this is, if you're already doing compliance, and of course, naturally, if you are, you have controls, you have security activities, which you can coin as controls, then leverage that to start your risk program. Really flip the coin over, and you'll see pretty quickly that, hey, I already have a lot of my risk identified. I maybe just don't have them documented. So before I move on to the next topic, I want to take another poll here. And Rob, if you don't mind launching that, really just asking, what's your primary role at your organization? So is that around compliance management? Is it around risk management? You manage both risk and compliance, or perhaps it's something else. Now, I've been speaking a lot to how compliance can be a good foundation for risk. And what I'm going to talk about here in a minute is just around risk programs themselves. So while everyone has a chance to respond, I'll just note, and I said this, I think, over the last couple of years, I've seen really the trend in our customer base of going from, 10 to 20% of folks out there are just managing risk and managing risk and compliance. And that trend now is probably ticking upwards of 80%. I see that we have here, we're give a few more minutes, or a few more seconds. Right now, we're right about 50%, close to 50% of managing both risk and compliance, and kind of an even split between compliance and risk. And hey, I see comments for we're kind of doing other things. So I'll take a peek here. Perfect. See if we had any other comments. All right. Well, let's close this out here in a second. Let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Perfect. Yeah, look, a pretty even split between compliance and risk, and then the majority of you are doing both. And yeah, and we've got several doing others, which is kind of awesome. So yeah, security and compliance, sure, absolutely. That's great. So thanks for the input. Appreciate it. All right. Let's go. All right. So before I really talk a little bit more about risk programs, and we're going to get there about how, again, I've mentioned this about how it really enables better conversations. I've got some really, I think, interesting information about having those executive and board conversations. But I think first, it's just important to visualize what risk programs involve. I borrowed this from an ISACA resource, Getting Started with Risk Management. You can see the major steps here. I think the key point from the publication, and maybe some of you have read this, but is that most organizations out there have some level of risk management activity going on in their business, but the majority of them kind of lack the depth and the specificity to really operate effectively over risk. So what that ultimately means is lots of people have risk management activities happening out there, but they're probably not necessarily formal. I love, again, the trend. I'm seeing this trend, even in here, almost 50% are doing both. And then we've got another 20% that are doing risk. So there's definitely some formal risk management out there. There's certainly more interest, and that's been the trend. But we know the number one reason for risk management, of course, is to protect the enterprise, but it's really doing that by having enterprise decision making, right? With better alignment of resources to focus on risk with the greatest potential negative impact. So we want to protect the organization. If we really have a formal risk management program, then we have insights, facts, and information that can support better decision making. And ultimately, that's what I think that's why we do it. So we have a lot about, here's our money that we have, our limited amount of resources. Where and how should we invest that money so we have the right controls to reduce the most risk? And ultimately, this visual, I think, paints a pretty good picture of what a risk management program looks like when it's in place. I just want to explore briefly just how we get there, right? So really at a high level, success at any type of activity or program requires effort in visualization and planning. This was, for my career as an auditor, was really a key moment to not just plan on it, but really first visualize the audit and think about what's the success of that activity. So here, for your risk program, if you haven't already done this, and even if you have one in place, just ask why or how will this risk program be successful? And I think if you have that conversation not with just yourself, but other stakeholders, using that vision of success, you'll find areas where you have mutual success. You can really understand, perhaps some people may think, well, success means that you spent the least amount of money on it. Others may say, well, you have the highest quality of a program, and there's lots of things in the middle, of course, but use that vision to then guide and kind of iterate and improve what you already have, or if you don't, certainly use that to plan and implement a program. Other key success factors would be getting involvement from all levels of the organization, certainly from the top down, using analysis and to identify the risk, your threats and vulnerabilities, and then just using some analysis to better understand all of those so that you understand their likelihood, their impact to the organization. If they were to materialize, what's the velocity? How quick would it impact my business? How quick would I be able to respond? I mean, all that's just part of analysis. Of course, remediation to reduce the risk via controls. And again, we've talked about this. You probably already have those from your security programs, your compliance programs. So just leveraging those to remediate the most risk. And then finally, just being prepared for the worst. So when a risk becomes real, knowing your business gets interrupted, a disaster strikes, just knowing that you're prepared and kind of what to do with that. So I'm just going to walk through kind of briefly. I'm not going to go through all the materials here, but just these are kind of there's 5 like key areas of risk. Certainly I talked about visualizing first, but then planning. And for those of you who already have risk programs, fantastic. Maybe you can use this to just, again, improve and iterate, constantly improving, certainly is a proactive activity. And those that you don't, here, this is kind of just a really high level roadmap. But certainly just thinking about goals and structure, visualizing that success. And then, if you're going to start, as we're, probably focused here on IT security or just information security as a whole, focusing this perhaps on cyber risk and IT risk, or certainly could be expanded out to an enterprise risk activity. But thinking about that, the scope, leveraging governance you already have in place, which likely you already have something in place for security or compliance, just leveraging that and expanding it so that you can use similar communication channels for communicating about risk, thinking and deciding about risk, such as like a risk committee or other. And then, defining what's the information that the organization needs to make decisions around risk, right? So you're going to just have a little bit different information than you would say for security and compliance. This is just making sure there's good communication and consistency around reporting. That's all good for the high level board stuff too, right? Getting involvement, I mentioned this, but getting involvement from the leaders, but also just through all the participants, and leveraging, again, what you already have probably in place for security and security awareness training and all those communication channels, but leveraging that and just expanding it to risk. Sharing materials on risk management practices, risk and vulnerability identification, concepts around remediation and controls. I mean, those are things I haven't typically seen in a security awareness program. So it's really just expanding out what you're already doing for security, but now let's just incorporate risk. And ultimately, you need everyone's help to identify risk, right? You need to not only identify, but also how do we react if we see something that's was a bad thing? How do we communicate that and get everyone prepared and kind of in action? Obviously need executive support and buy-in from that, but I think in today's world, that's been a little bit easier and easier to get their attention. And having that right tone of accountability has been a big key in my career, and I think ultimately for a success of a risk program, where I've been in organizations where that key, yet the appropriate tone of accountability for risk and managing risk and taking action, when that's been in place, the risk program and everyone's just participation from top to the top down in the organization has been fantastic. Where that support and sort of level of accountability for doing risk and doing all the right things isn't there, everyone kind of struggles, and it makes things, I think, pretty inefficient, but most importantly, very ineffective. Then the identification analysis piece. I mean, this is certainly you need this information, right, so that you can communicate and think about risk. So just having a structure of, hey, what's your appetite for risk? What's the risk target mean? Those are typically executive and board level discussions, but you need to understand, or your CISO or CIOs understanding where do we need to do, where do we need to land, and how do we calibrate all of this? Like, what are the factors? What's the math we're going to do to quantify risk, and then have some consistent way to judge it and score it, so we can ultimately make better decisions. That's going to all include the supporting processes and methods to identify risk, and who's going to gather it, how do we gather it, what's all the information we need, is that internal information, is that external information? Again, this is just putting the process together, and ultimately just being able to identify and build out the registers. And that isn't just risk, as you can see on here, it's also vulnerabilities and threats, and of course your controls, and pulling all that together to ultimately come out with a risk score, because you need to quantify risk so that you can really make ultimately better decisions to compare one risk to the other, because the nature of the risk is going to be different, but you really consistently need to understand how does it impact your organization. And if you don't do this, right, if you don't identify your risk, it's going to cost money. And this is a study from late last year that shows, look, when you have risks that aren't managed and you have data breaches and incidents, the average cost of a data breach in the US in 2021 was $9 million. And 38% of that was also attributed to lost business. So, that goes back to the topic of trust. So when you have a breach of trust, well, then you tend to lose business from that end. Nearly $8 million was the cost of an insider-related cyber breach. And what really astonishes me is it's more than 9 months to actually, when you have identified a breach to when you have corrected the breach, it takes nearly 9 months on average, which I think is just astonishing, quite frankly. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is not only it costs a lot of money, but it's that eroding of trust. And again, that's why we should be thinking about our risk management program to be the best that it can be, not only to help make decisions, but really protect us against this. And really the biggest issue here is just reputational damage. If that organization gets breached and it's publicized, it's significantly damaging for small to medium-sized businesses. And I recognize that enterprise businesses out there can potentially, and there's examples of this where they've continued to regain the trust and the revenues over time. But definitely really interesting. As we send the materials out, there's a link in here if you want to read more about the study, but pretty good information. All right, a few more things here. So just as we think about continuing building out risk, making better decisions on risk. It's really leveraging gaps. So what I mean by this are gaps is commonly used in this industry. One gap is that my controls aren't in place or that they're not working effectively. That's a control gap. The risk gap is really thinking about, okay, I've done all this math and I know this is my residual risk. This is all the risk that's left over. How does that compare to my appetite for risk or my target risk score? What else do I need to do to make it better? And I've listed some principles in here just about how to go about this, accepting no unnecessary risk, because that can create a lot of gaps on the risk end. If it's not necessary to take the risk, then don't do that. Making risk decisions at the right levels, that's just really who has the authority, responsibility, and I think the knowledge to make those decisions. Obviously, weighing cost and benefits, that's really just deploying the right resources for the risk. And then anticipating and managing risk, right? Being prepared and all that. That's really important. And I've got a slide in here. This isn't for me to, it's certainly business continuity is a piece of this, but it's largely just knowing what you're going to do about it, right? If you do have a risk or an incident or a data breach, what are you going to do? How are you going to react? Who's involved? What if it's the third party, that one of your processors, and how are you going to react to that? It's just knowing, across communication channels and reviewing key systems, doing simulations, and then really importantly, sharing results. So if you do these activities and simulations, if you have breakdowns, learn from them, put in improvements, and just continuously working on this, because as we know, the risk landscape continues to change, and what you have today may or may not work in the future. So I'm sure, being fellow Floridians, we all know that there's hurricanes and other natural disasters that I'm sure we have plans in place. And now that the COVID-19 pandemic's been in here, I'm sure there's things in place for that, but we don't know what the next thing will be. So it's just, again, continuously improving this and being better at it. And being prepared is, it doesn't mean that you just have a plan. It's really being prepared, right? Being proactive. And I like this: past performance may not reflect future performance. That's where I'm talking about, hurricanes and COVID, pandemics and all that. They're just because those are the things we've had in the past doesn't mean what we're going to have in the future. And it's just continuously, thinking about being proactive and just thinking about what could happen out there. Leveraging, what you have from everyone being a risk steward. So this is where we talk about everyone being involved. Hey, everyone's a risk steward. So when things do happen negatively, everyone has a role in this, and just making sure that we've communicated everyone what their role is in this. So, and then just a few other best practices on, implementing and operating an IT risk management program. Again, accountability. It's everyone's responsibility to be prepared and know how to respond, but also how to identify risk. Championing that from the top. I've mentioned this a couple of times, and it's really important. So if you don't have that, right, we can certainly talk maybe in the Q&A session about how to get there. But I know that's a challenge if you don't have it, but certainly it's vitally important. Continue to conduct risk assessments on a timely basis. So making sure your risk profile is up to date, doing that, not just once a year, but, your really important risk, do it frequently. Maybe it's every quarter. Maybe it's even more frequently than that, if depending on how much things are changing around you. And then prioritizing risk. And I think ultimately just implementing the right treatment, which would include strong controls, and realize treatment could also be trying to transfer, insure, and do other things. It isn't just controls. That's not the only one. The thing of the strong controls, though, I think, again, I've mentioned this with the two sides of the coin. You can start a risk program from your compliance, right? If you already have strong security controls in place, data privacy controls in place, leveraging that information to create your risk profile, your risk register, it really enables you to do that pretty quickly and effectively to ultimately become a formal risk program. Now, as promised, again, other things, a final area of risk practice that I think is overlooked, or at least it's underappreciated, is that board and executive conversation and all the oversight. And boards certainly are asking more and more questions out there in the IT risk management, IT security space. We know their confidence is low. The studies that I showed earlier, it's only 9%. But I think the real question here is, what are boards asking and why are they asking it? And really, how should you be prepared and how should you respond? I think putting this in context, right? What do boards care about? Boards care about the organization's mission, their ultimate, why are they in their vision? Why are they in business? They care about revenues. They care about cost. Those two together, of course, equal profitability. And they care about risk posture, right? They want to know where they stand with risk. Boards are more and more informed on IT security and IT risk management. So I think they really have more confidence in their ability to ask relevant questions. And I think all the negative media headlines out there really get their attention. Now, a recent Gartner article highlights 5 security questions that your board will ask. I want to look maybe at a couple of these, and we can always come back, in Q&A if you have more questions. But the first one's about the incident, as I call it, the incident question. And that is, how did this incident happen? I thought you had this under control. Like, what went wrong? So the board's asking this because they're aware that there was an incident in the organization, or the CISO is making them aware. And they just want to know really that the organization's secure, especially with all, their perception. The workforce is at home. We're doing all this business remotely, and their head spinning. So they just want to know that, hey, we're really secure, even though we had this incident. I think the way you respond to that is just sticking to the facts, right? You want to acknowledge the incident happens. Here's the business impact. If you know that, here's other facts like, well, here were some existing gaps and here's we didn't fix them or why. Here's the action plans to fix them. And if there's other areas that you don't know about or you need to uncover, here's the action plans to go uncover it. I think just sticking to the facts as opposed to just being all over the place and emotional about it, or even defensive, it would certainly enable better conversations. Now, look, the board's probably going to ask lots of questions about the facts, but if you stick to that, the facts are the facts. You can't really argue with those. I think all of these questions are really interesting. I love that, are we 100% secure? I think as we have security professionals out there, it's really not possible to be 100% secure, but boards may not necessarily understand that. As much as their knowledge has grown, many of them won't really understand that. We can talk more about that again in Q&A if you'd like. They ask about what happened at other companies. They're asking that because they want to understand the landscape of risk and just certainly want to know, did we do business with that company? Are we okay? That's really why they're asking questions around that. There's the resource allocation, which again, we know that seems to be a big challenge here, right? Is, well, what are we asking about that? It's really just they're asking about, do we spend too much? Or are we spending not enough? Because they just really want to know, are we being proactive? That's what's really behind that. And they don't want to stand in the way of, we didn't spend enough or we spent too much. They just ultimately want the security team and our risk management team to be proactive. And they know that things are constantly changing, but that's really what they're trying to get at. The last one I want to touch on is really what keeps you up at night. I've been hearing this for 20 plus years in these kind of conversations. And it's really trying to get at risk acceptance and whether or not they've accepted too much risk or too little risk. And that's really important because that ties back into their priorities. That risk posture is really important to them because they want to know that the company is going to continue to be able to achieve its mission, to continue to have great revenues at low cost and be profitable. And so what you should focus on is, here's the big ticket items that you control, right? That's like loss of intellectual property, compliance with regulations. Maybe there's third-party risk out there. Those are the things you should focus on and have that conversation. And it is as much as like, hey, I'm scared about this. It's like, here's what we're doing to control these things and why things are protected. And of course, if they're not, and you need more, this is where you have that conversation. Now, to this end, I've reviewed Gartner's thoughts on what boards will ask IT management and why, but I want to take our final poll. So Rob, you want to spin that up? So everyone, what is your board or executive team's biggest interest in IT risk and information security? So first is incidents, like what happened and why. The security performance side of it, are we spending too little or too much? What's the risk landscape and what's changing? Or your risk posture, have we accepted too much or too little? Or perhaps it's something else. I'll give you a few moments here to respond. I'm pretty passionate about this area. As I was a chief audit executive for a number of years, reporting up to the board, and at least I enjoyed the conversations, but they're always challenging conversations. And of course, that was more than 6 years ago. And I think today's conversations are even more focused on this area of risk and security. So let's give here a few more minutes. All right, let's count back 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll close that out. Thank you. All right, so it looks like here we've got, well, it's kind of a third here is what happened and why in our own company's incidents. So that's, I guess that makes a lot of sense, right? The boards want to know, hey, we had a problem and why did it happen? Again, stick to the facts. Another third is just the risk landscape, kind of what's changing out there. I think that was one of the challenges that was mentioned as well. Certainly makes sense. I mean, again, headlines get out there that I think from my experience, boards are paying attention a lot to the headlines. And so you want to put their minds at ease of, what's, how's it impacting us and what we're doing about it. And certainly the other areas are important as well, but those two seem to be the biggest challenges. So thanks for responding. All right, let me move on here. Kind of get this rolling here. I know we have about 10 minutes left. I want to be sure we have some time for questions. So look, one of the questions I get, and I've seen this from numerous polls from my own company's customer base, but lots of it's just, hey, when do I use tools to help me? And we've talked about some of the challenges here, so I don't need to necessarily go through that. But I think tools ultimately help you get information organized and put you in a better position where you have the facts and you have the insights to roll up, not just compliance, but also risk, and really understand how the two are connected, and even connected to your business priorities that really allow you to do this in a very efficient way, but most importantly, an effective way to get that information assembled and then be able to have those conversations. I think it also will, naturally tend to free people up from doing, repetitive and menial tasks so that they can then focus on strategy and risk identification and risk treatments and all the good things that they're doing out in risk and security. I think, again, the tool here will allow you to be more strategic, right? Strategic is really important because that's what boards want to do. That's what executives want. They want to have those strategic conversations. And while I don't have this in this presentation, we've certainly been seeing the CISO's role changing and evolving from the naysayer to really the business enabler. And so this, having tools, again, with the information to have better risk-guided strategic business decisions, keeping teams connected by sharing information, also kind of knowing if you're on the right track and giving time back is really a big benefit for the tools. You can also go, take compliance to improve your risk management. You really go beyond and above and beyond pretty easily than just checking the box, sharing the wins. And again, I think freeing your team to focus on the activities in security and risk, as opposed to, assembling information to do a report. One of the things I want to share too, just be able to connect compliance and cyber risk. This is actually a tool that we've put on the market, but really it takes automatically your cybersecurity and data privacy controls, and it maps over. This is through the secure controls framework, but then it displays to you what we call a periodic table of risk, and it's IT risk. So it gives you kind of insight almost instantly to, hey, based on the controls that you've assessed and implemented, here's what we think your risk posture looks like. And it's really literally takes a minute to do that. So it's definitely possible. Just a couple of closing thoughts here. I mean, again, risk is everyone's responsibility. You have, I know many of you, probably all of you have security programs out there and compliance, and it's certainly a great way and a very good gateway to starting the IT risk program. And certainly the two should be talking with each other, right? And I think here, just again, leveraging that existing information, encouraging ownership throughout the company. You've heard me say that 2 or 3 times. It's really, really important to just have activity and awareness across the company for risk as well as security, of course. Ultimately, building the metrics, the dashboards, all that kind of promotes transparency, accountability, is in that theme of risk being everyone's responsibility. And it really allows you, again, leveraging tools when you put all that together to communicate the criticality, the context of risk and security in the context of achieving your business goals. So as I wrap up today, just keep in mind there's more and more stakeholder scrutiny on and interest on what you're doing today, and that would be areas of IT security and IT risk. The board and stakeholder scrutiny and knowledge have certainly increased over the past few years, but apparently their confidence is still really low that risks are being managed appropriately. Now, risk, we all know risk is unavoidable, and more companies, I'm sure those of you out there are prioritizing risk as really important step towards implementing and refining compliance programs, security programs, and activities. So viewing and measuring risk holistically, just at the high organization level, really isn't enough to manage risk today. You really need to think about identifying and categorizing risk as part of your business activities, and really at the operational level. It's critical to truly understanding, quantifying, and reducing those risks, not only to reduce risk itself, but really to enable better conversations with your board and your executives, ultimately to enable stronger trust with all your stakeholders. Just a quick plug. So if you want to learn more about my company, Reciprocity, you can certainly visit us at reciprocity.com. We publish a weekly GRC digest, and I also publish that on LinkedIn. So if you can sign up there as well. And you can reach out to us on socials as well as me on LinkedIn. Happy to answer further questions there. With that, Rob, I'm going to turn this over to questions if the audience has any. I think we have a few minutes here, and I know there's some stuff in the chat. So
wonderful. Let's take a quick peek. So the first thing that always comes up in these types of presentations is whether or not the slide deck will be made available. And so just so everybody knows, David's been kind enough to make sure that will be available to us. And we've gone ahead and posted the PDF version of the deck on the website already under our event materials, so you can check it out there. There, of course, are other questions coming in as well. Let's hop into it. What are your biggest risk concerns that should be on all of our radars for 2022 and beyond?
Wow, what are the biggest risks that are out there? Again, I think the biggest risk that I see, and I mentioned this in the presentation, but it's really just the digital transformation out there. I mean, businesses have rapidly changed how they do business. Not only just for people working remotely, I think we're kind of getting through that, but just the more the commercial side of business, how we sell products and services, how we get paid, and it's really through far more third-party services. I think that's the biggest risk that's still out there. Certainly, there's the global, economics from supply chains, from conflicts around the world. I mean, all that certainly depends on your market and how that's affecting you. But I really do believe this digital transformation and things just getting put in place, people not necessarily understanding the technologies and how they're going about it, and kind of they're doing it rapidly. Believe me, not all businesses have changed everything, but there's a lot of pressure out there to do things rapidly, and I think there's a lot of things getting overlooked. That's certainly, as I look across the landscape, one of the areas I would focus on. Now, it may or may not be appropriate for your own business, but because maybe you're already past all that, but it's certainly something to think about.
Makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another thing that sometimes comes up in these types of conversations, especially around communicating with those charged with governance, is techniques or methods or approaches for having the board and management accept the responsibility for decisions that they choose to take, as well as decisions they choose not to take, right? Whether it's having them sign off on some kind of risk assessment or form or whatever. What are some insights that you have about those types of conversations?
Yeah, no, I fully understand where that comes from. First of all, I just want to say that you look, boards are pretty sensitive about documenting things, especially when it comes to risk decisions, just being quite frank. One of the strategies is certainly to be sure that what is being presented is just logged in the minutes, of those, again, executive committees, risk committees, board committees, whatever it may be, but just logging that in the minutes. it's probably, again, they're risk averse, and I'm sure their general counsels don't want them logging every risk decision that's made. But I know that's among one of the strategies you can do. Again, sticking to the facts is a great strategy, and also just sharing vision, right? Understanding what is success and what isn't. But I know where that's alluding to. Look, they decided not to do anything about this risk. That risk turns into an incident because it materializes, and then you get the blame that why didn't you fix this, and you're just following their decision. So that's really, I think, the best thing you can do is really just to get things logged from that and what's presented, and again, sticking to the facts. I mean, ultimately, if it's a, again, depending on the impact of it, certainly you could try to encourage to get that documented, right, one way or another.
Makes
But I mean,
sense.
it's kind of a CYA activity. I totally
Yeah,
get it.
delicate and diplomatic tasks that beset
It
us
is.
all, right?
It is.
Well, thanks so much, Dave, and thanks to
Sure.
the entire Reciprocity team and Lascelles, and thanks, Pete, for joining me and hosting another session of ISACA South Florida
Yeah.
webinars. We hope that you can join us in approximately, actually just less than a month, on May 11th for our annual general meeting. Look out for information coming for that meeting. That will be an in-person meeting. One way or another, we're going to make it happen, and I look forward to seeing anyone who can and will turn out for that. So
Awesome.
thanks, everybody. Look out for future information. Have a great afternoon. Talk to you soon.
Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.